right, in this section, we're going to talk about the different senses and the sensory systems. So in this first section, we're going to do an overview of the sensory receptors and sensations in general. So sensory receptor is responsible for converting the signals from the environment, or also called stimuli, into nerve impulses. So we have to take that information from the outside world and then convert it into impulses that can then be registered and processed by our central nervous system. Now this conversion process is called sensory transduction. And this is done with exteroreceptors. Those are going to be sensory receptors that detect stimulus from the outside of the body. So things like taste, smell, vision, hearing, equilibrium, all of that is information from without the body. This is going to be continuously sending messages to the central nervous system to make us aware of our surroundings and what's going on around us. There are also, though, interoreceptors. These are going to be responsible for receiving stimuli from inside the body. So, for example, baroreceptors or pressoreceptors. These are going to respond to changes in blood pressure. Osmoreceptors monitor our water salt imbalance. Chemoreceptors monitor the pH of the blood. These are all going to be directly involved in homeostasis and are going to be primarily regulated by negative feedback mechanisms. So there are different types of sensory receptors. Those are going to be classified into 4 different categories: chemoreceptors, photoreceptors, mechanoreceptors, and thermoreceptors. Those chemoreceptors are going to be responsible for responding to chemical stimuli. So, for example, things like our taste, smell, a blood pH, those are all chemical stimuli, and they're going to be picked up by chemoreceptors. Nocioreceptors, or our pain receptors, are a specific type of chemoreceptor. Naked dendrites that respond to chemicals released by damaged tissue. So what happens is when your tissue is damaged, it releases a particular chemical that is picked up by the nocioreceptors, which our brain then interprets as pain. Photoreceptors are going to be those receptors that respond to light. Mechanoreceptors are stimulated by mechanical forces. So, for example, we'll talk about it a little bit later on. Our hearing is going to be controlled by mechanoreceptors. Balance is controlled by mechanoreceptors. Touch, blood pressure, stretch receptors in your stomach, proprioreceptors. There are so many different types of mechanoreceptors that are found without the body that help regulate and maintain homeostasis. We also have thermoreceptors. Thermoreceptors are stimulated by changes in temperature, and they're responsible for helping to regulate body temperature. We do have thermoreceptors in both our hypothalamus and our skin. This is why we can feel when something is hot or when something is cold, is because we have thermoreceptors found in our skin. So here is a wonderful little table of a bunch of different types of exteroreceptors. It's going to break down all of the different receptors, what their stimulus is, what sort of category they fall into, what sense they're responsible for, where they might be located. So I strongly recommend spend just a little bit of time going over this table of receptors. It'll be very helpful as we continue on with the rest of this chapter. All right, so the one other thing I want to mention is the role of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system in sensation and sensory perception. Sensation is the conscious perception of stimuli. It's going to occur in our cerebral cortex. The sensation that results depends on which part of the brain receives that nerve signal. So before those sensory receptors can initiate a nerve signal, they have to carry out integration. We have to take that information from our sensory neurons, bring it over to our interneurons, and then process that information before we can then send that message out to our motor neurons. Most types of sensory receptors will eventually stop responding if they are continuously stimulated. This is ultimately going to lead you to become less aware of that stimulus. Now, this is what's known as sensory adaptation. It's just a decrease in response to a stimulus over time. It's going to vary depending on the type of receptors. Things like the smell receptor, pressure, touch, those adapt very quickly. Smell is one of the very fastest to adapt. So if you do go on in other courses to do things like dissections, there are certain things you can do to cover up the smell or avoid the smell of the preservatives, but honestly, the very best thing you can do for yourself is just step inside the room, breathe it in deep, and just get used to it. Your smell receptor is going to adapt very, very quickly. It's better to just adapt to the smell than to be constantly trying to avoid it or mask it by using other powerful smells to cover it up. So that's one of the fastest ones to adapt. Pressure and touch are pretty fast as well. This is why you're not really cognizant of your clothing touching you all over all of the time. It's not practical information. Once your brain processes that information, goes, oh, I'm wearing clothes, then you kind of forget about it and you move on with your day. You don't want your brain to be constantly bombarded with messages that aren't necessarily super relevant. But there are certain messages that are very important that we don't ever want to adapt. So, for example, there are receptors that are found in your muscles and joints. They never stop sending signals to your brain. If they did, you would randomly tip over. Your body would suddenly be like, oh, I'm not processing any information anymore, no new information, I'm going to just tip over. So your parts of your senses that are responsible for helping you maintain your equilibrium, helping you maintain your posture, those are always active. Those are always sending information because it's very important. All right, and that's it for this section. So you should be able to describe the functions of the 4 different types of sensory receptors, distinguish between sensation and integration, and then summarize the importance of sensory receptors in the maintenance of homeostasis in the body. All right, please let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns.